So, hello, my name is Hannia Arevalo. I am a senior opinion columnist in the Cornell Daily Sun.
Hi, my name is Elise Clifford. I'm also an opinion columnist for the Cornell Daily Sun. And we have the pleasure of being joined by Bret Stephens, who is an opinion columnist for the New York Times and who has previously won a Pulitzer Prize for his work with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for joining us. And we wanted to ask you some questions specifically about your talk that you gave last evening in Carmen. So the first question, last evening you mentioned institutional neutrality, and I wanted to know, given that under this administration, academia and scientific research and overall undergraduate programs have been susceptible to a lot of attacks and funding cuts, how do you think that institutions can remain not politicized while undergoing these things?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be back in Ithaca for the first time in 35 years. I didn't go to Cornell, but my friends who did loved it. So institutional neutrality, I think, involves, or it requires universities not to take positions on political questions that do not immediately affect the functioning of universities. So I don't think that the standard of institutional neutrality applies to the questions that have been raised by the Trump administration's attacks on several American universities over the last year. And I think that universities have a clear obligation to speak to precisely these sorts of challenges that are being raised by the government.
And so, still on this type of subject, yesterday you mentioned that you believed a big issue with the political discourse was experts or self-proclaimed experts going out of their way to make bold statements that convince, because ultimately bolder statements have a tendency to convince more than looser claims. And so how is it compatible for politics to involve everyone while experts must stick to their specific lanes?
There are two competing values here. One is academic freedom. The other is academic responsibility. And you often hear professors talk about their academic freedom, which I grant, but that goes with a set of responsibilities. If you're a physics professor, but you come to class in a kafia and spend the first 15 minutes of your lecture talking about Gaza, you may be exercising academic freedom, but you are not exercising academic responsibility, because your students came presumably to hear you talk about your area of expertise, physics, not Middle Eastern politics. And I think there's been an unfortunate tendency in academia and in the broader community of people with academic expertise to offer themselves as authorities on issues that are far afield from their areas. And that, unfortunately, but inevitably, has had the result of degrading in the public mind the idea of the value of experts. Because really, what you're talking about are people who are just mouthing off on political subjects while using their standing as, say, a professor to lend an aura of authority that they haven't earned. And even if all professors are entitled to their opinions on any number of subjects, I think it's important for the good name of academia and its reputation in the public at large to be very judicious when it comes to offering themselves as authorities on subjects where they have no particular authority. You know, we live in an era of declining trust in institutions. My own institution, the media, the news media suffering from declining trust, but also in academia as well. And that poses, I think, a profound threat to the long-term health of the academic enterprise if more and more people don't see universities like Cornell as impartial truth seekers, but come to see them as partisan truth asserters, if you will. That puts the entire profession, the entire institution at risk.
Yesterday evening, you also said that you are a Pride Zionist. What, in your opinion, constitutes an attack on Jewish identity? In the spirit of respectful disagreement, can you explain to me why?
Why what?
Why or why not?
Why am I a proud Zionist?
Or why, what constitutes an attack on a Jewish identity and why it constitutes an attack?
Well, the idea of Zionism is no different from the idea of so many other forms of nationalism, whether it's Danish nationalism or Japanese nationalism or Kenyan nationalism. It's one nationalist set of beliefs among many. Most of the world is divided into nation states. Many of those nation states were formed in ways that created ethnic tensions because minority groups ended up becoming a part of that nation state. Ask yourself about the situation of Kashmiris in India, Tamils in Sri Lanka, Tibetans in China. The list is extremely long. I'm a Zionist because I think that Jews, as one of the oldest nations in the world, have as much a right to a nation state as any other group. And I believe in Jewish self-rule, which means that Jews should not have to live under the thumb of others, but I also believe that Jews should not have others live under theirs in Israel. And so I believe in a two-state solution. The very difficult question, is how you achieve a two-state solution in a way that doesn't put the Jewish state at risk. Now, when it comes to anti-Zionism, I think two issues often are confused. One is criticism of the policy of the State of Israel. That is a totally legitimate enterprise. Whether I agree with that particular criticism or not, it is absolutely legitimate and often necessary to criticize the policies of a government. We do so here in the United States all the time. If, for example, you don't like the policies of the Trump administration, it doesn't make you anti-American. It just makes you a critic of the government. And there are many people who criticize the Netanyahu government over innumerable issues, and they are not anti-Zionists. They're just critical of the government. Anti-Zionism takes the form of belief that the Jewish state in itself is an illegitimate state that should not exist. And the reason I find that often to be anti-Semitic is because that's a criticism that is leveled in that way against no other state. I don't see people outside of the Kremlin saying Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist. I don't see people saying Bangladesh doesn't have a right to exist. Name your state. Nobody is saying that. So when people are singling out the Jewish state in a way they are not singling out other states, that's a double standard. And double standards, when applied to Jews, are an expression of anti-Semitism.
So this is still a question on tolerance and being able to have respectful disagreement. Recently, the Cornell Sun published a very controversial opinion piece that was on MAGA. It's a piece that supported MAGA, and it received over 200 critical comments. And there's been a question of whether or not this should be the type of opinion that we platform here, or whether it's pushing it too far. Do you have any opinion on that?
I say all power to the brave author of that piece for sticking to his or her guns and expressing a view that is contrary to the views of so many other students. And I would be worried about Cornell if the upshot was that such pieces won't be published again, or if the social penalties for the student who wrote that piece, I assume it was a student, wound up being so severe that the student left the campus. Listen, 74 million Americans or something like that voted for Donald Trump. Are they not welcome at a university like Cornell? Are their opinions so anathema that Cornell students can't even afford to, or can't even hear them or read them, I guess? I hope the answer to that is no. You know, I often object to the substance of a lot of what this administration does. But I don't think it's possible to understand America without understanding the legitimacy of some of the complaints that helped Trump return to office even after the disgrace of January 6, 2021. I think Trump was responding to at least three, if not more, currents in American life that people who inhabit the so-called elite were just deaf, dumb, and blind to. Number one, the reality of essentially unchecked mass migration and the stress that was putting on communities all over America, but particularly in the border areas. Number two, a palpable sense that while parts of the country were doing extremely well in a knowledge economy, other parts of the country were falling further behind in a manufacturing and service economy. And number three, the belief that the so-called expert class was increasingly partisan, increasingly self-serving, and increasingly dishonest. There were other issues, of course, too, but I think that those of us who inhabit the corridors of elite media or elite academia need to think deeply about that MAGA message. And if we don't, we'll only continue to be clobbered at the ballot box and find ourselves scratching our heads and asking, how did that happen?
Continuing on the topic of respectful disagreement, I personally have an opinion column called Nideki Nidaya that is centered around starting and continuing political discourse in polarized institutions like Cornell. Much like your respectful disagreement columns, I find it that people presume that their opposition is often unwilling to hear their arguments, forgetting to have the same goals, like you mentioned, justice, fairness, and humanity. Do you see any solution to this obstacle of ideological segregation, as you called it, considering conversation among the American public is increasingly polarized or non-existent?
I like the title of your column, neither here nor there. Look, there's something I said yesterday evening that got a kind of a bit of a laugh. I said a great argument is like great sex. It's frictional, it's mutual, and sometimes it's generative. And I really believe that. People should enjoy arguments, and people shouldn't mistake an argument about a policy with a moral or personal difference. If universities aren't fostering a culture of vigorous argument, or at least great conversation, they are failing in their task. And how can you learn something if everyone around you just agrees with you all the time, or if they don't agree, they just stay silent? There's a wonderful phrase, rabbinical phrase called, it's translated as argument for the sake of heaven. And in at least my tradition, the Jewish tradition, we believe that dissenting arguments if they're offered in good faith, are just as important as the dominant argument. So the Jewish tradition has always sort of looked at the dissenters, and instead of removing them from the tradition, it's tried to inscribe them in the tradition. And I think that helps explain aspects of our own civilization which are very valuable. Why, for example, when you have the Supreme Court issuing a ruling, does it publish not just the majority opinion, but also the dissenting and the concurring opinions? Because it wants a record of how the court at a given moment in time thought about, but also differed over a particular question. And sometimes you have the dissenting view surviving to win the day many years later. Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson, an 8-1 decision in favor of segregation in 1896, his decision became central to the Brown v. Board decision in the 1950s, ending the horror of segregation. And so you cannot have, I think, a community of thoughtful learners unless you are constantly willing to engage and promote and platform opposing points of view. And when people are reluctant to speak up, I think it's the obligation of professors to get them to speak up and to feel that in doing so, they're not running social or academic risks, that in fact that they are enriching the overall intellectual environment of the school, and hopefully the social environment too.
So similarly, I have a column that's more centered on changing your mind, which is something that you mentioned yesterday, and on how certainty can be very temporary, and maybe sometimes it should be. So my question is, do you have an opinion today that you would have been surprised to learn would develop at the beginning of your career?
Oh, yeah, sure, tons of opinions. And I wrote a column, just been talking about this, I was wrong about Trump voters. My first column about Donald Trump began with the words, if by now you don't find Donald Trump appalling, you're appalling. I really regret that column. I used to be much more of a climate skeptic. I spent some real time and some real effort and some real thought into rethinking my views about climate. I don't think I satisfied a lot of my critics, but I deeply rethought my views. You have to say to yourself, whether you're 18, 19, 20, however old you are, do you really think you're totally in possession of the truth on every political subject? Have you got it all figured out, really? I mean, only fools think that. If you have the benefit of being right half the time, that's miraculous. If you think you're right 90% of the time, you're dangerous. You're dangerous because you're filled with a lot of certitude and you don't know where you're wrong. And that makes you a danger to others, but it also makes you a danger to yourself. Humility, intellectual humility, is a good way to walk through life.
I agree. And so still on the idea of things changing, yesterday you mentioned that one of Europe's fatal mistakes was disregarding a part of its civilizational heritage.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, how is a civilizational identity that has a rich culture that somehow makes it rigid in a way, how is that compatible with immigration? Or how would you see that as compatible with immigration?
Listen, I'm the son of a refugee to the United States. My mother came, having been a hidden child during the Holocaust, came to America as a displaced person with no passport and $7 to her name. So I owe everything I have to America's welcoming attitude towards immigrants. But the responsibility of immigrants is to assimilate to the host society. It's not the responsibility of the host society to adapt itself to the immigrant. And by the way, this works in both directions. If I move to Japan, I'm not going to expect people around me to learn more English. I'm going to make the effort to learn Japanese, right? Or the same in any other country I can think of. But there are too many places, particularly in Europe, where there doesn't seem to be that same set of expectations. I think host countries have a right to expect that migrants will not just learn the language and follow the laws, but honor the culture and spirit of the societies they're in. That doesn't mean that Muslims have to convert to Christianity or anything like that, but just realize that France, for example, stands for a set of values. One of them is secularism. I, by the way, feel that the French take secularism too far, but if I were to move to France, I would try to honor that spirit because I made the choice to move to France. But if you see large populations within France which fundamentally reject the values of the French state, I think that's problematic. And the fact that Europe has tolerated it for a host of complex reasons threatens the civilizational integrity of what Europe is about. I'm Jewish, I'm not Christian, but I do think Europe is foundationally a Christian civilization. And I don't think that's insulting, because I also think the Middle East or North Africa are basically Muslim civilizations. That's just the nature of them. Now, Europe is Christian civilization leavened by the values of the Enlightenment, which include tolerance, religious pluralism, and so on. And I think that's a vast improvement over the old Christian civilization, but it has to have that root. And when you lose touch with that root, then you have to ask yourself, well, what exactly are you defending? There have been polls in multiple European countries like Germany and Italy and France, which show that an astonishing number of young people have no interest in defending their country in the event of an attack. And then they wonder why Russia is invading Ukraine. If you don't know what your civilization is about, why would you be willing to defend it? So you have to have a civilization, you have to teach what it's about, you have to teach that it has some value that's worth defending, and then you have a chance of preserving it. Otherwise, Europe becomes what Lebanon once was, which is a garden without walls. What happens to a garden without walls? People come in and pick the fruit. So that's how I think Europe has to think of itself. And I don't think that has to be chauvinistic or racist, but it has to have a level of civilizational self-awareness and pride, and that has to exist at the center of politics, not the fringes.
All right. You mentioned the host society, right? How does this translate to the categorization of the United States as a melting pot?
Right. Of course, I don't know if we're a melting pot or a salad bowl or whatever metaphor you want to choose. But there is a reason why a pluribus unum is a national standard. The United States is an exceptional country in many respects in terms of achievement and size, but I think it's an exceptional country in a philosophical respect, and that's this. We Americans are more interested in who we are becoming than where we were from. I mean, I'm very proud to be Jewish. I'm very proud to be the son of a refugee. I'm very proud that I grew up in Mexico City, that I speak fluent Spanish. But my identity is wrapped up with my activity and my aspiration. I want to be a great journalist. I want to be a good writer. I want to offer in a productive, thoughtful way something to this country that puts me and my identity in a forward-looking, not backward-looking direction. And I think that's, in a sense, the way we're truly American. I think one of the things that has happened in the last 30 or 40 years that has damaged the fabric of American society is increasing identitarianism, the increasing hyphenization of American identity. And I say this let me say this in a modulated way, right? Because I'm not opposed to a hyphenated identity. If you're Mexican American, Jewish American, French American, great. But I hope that the accent or the italics are under the words are with the words American. That is the unifying ideal and mentality that unites us as a country and lies at the center of our self-understanding. I think a lot of people who engaged in identity politics on the left are shocked and dismayed when suddenly they discover that there's an identity politics on the right. But once you've opened that can of worms of identity politics, you shouldn't be shocked or dismayed. If you can be, more Hispanic American or Black American or whatever, don't be surprised when the Tucker Carlsons of the world say, hey, well, what about white America? Because they're just playing the same game. It's the wrong game. The right game is to say we are Americans irrespective of our origins, race, and other cultural or natural features of our life. We're Americans in terms of belonging to a shared community with a common set of aspirations and values and founding principles.
Okay, now we're going to move away from politics in general. What are some words of advice for aspiring columnists in the Cornell Sun hoping to influence discussion, the way that you've done throughout your career?
So, I sometimes think that writing a column is a little bit like cooking a meal. And it requires three things. You have to have a well-stocked pantry. You have to have fresh foods in your fridge, and you have to have an ability to use what's in your pantry and your fridge to create a meal that's appetizing. What you should be doing in college is stocking your pantry. And by that I mean, if you're going to write an article about the situation in Iran, your pantry is your deeper knowledge about the history of Iran, its the longer-term history, as well as what Iran has been for the past 47 years, and so on. What's in your fridge is what's happening this week, right? Your knowledge of the news. And the cooking is in the skill with which you're able to put together kind of the long-held items and the perishables in a way that makes for a compelling argument. So if you're going to be a good columnist, you really have to read very widely and almost a little bit indiscriminately, because you never know what's going to be in the news the next week. So my advice is read history ferociously. Have a sense of the world. Make sure that your mental map of the world is not only geographically accurate, but historically accurate, chronologically accurate. If I say what happened in the Middle East in 1956 and you don't know the answer, that's a problem, right? It's not just some random date. It's problematic because it means that you're not going to be able to make connections between dots if you don't know where and what the dots are. And so there's no short-term fix for that, except pick up books and constantly find yourself in a curious frame of mind and saying, gosh, who is Reza Pahlavi, and what was the Pahlavi dynasty, and how did it come into power, and how did it fall? I'm just offering you an example. The other thing is to read great literature. Great literature, first of all, enriches your life. Second of all, it's enjoyable. But thirdly, it tells you something about the human condition. You learn more from reading Pride and Prejudice or Anna Karenina than you're going to learn from most of your textbooks. Certainly more in terms of what's valuable in life. Third point is memorize poetry. The words you read are also words you can speak, and words you can speak are words that you hear. And people will turn to columnists who can write beautifully, can turn a phrase well. And when I was a kid, my dad, my late father of blessed memory, insisted that I memorize poems. And so I have all these poems in my head. And when you can actually speak them, you learn something about the nature of language. You know, Gerard Manley Hopkins says, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not reck his rod?" Forget the meaning of those words. It's very religious. Think of the sound of those words. That's what's so extraordinary about the poetry. And as you develop your style as a columnist, take the time to read it out loud and say to yourself, does that sound good? Yeah, another analogy. If you listen to the Rolling Stones, I'm dating myself, but if you listen to the Rolling Stones, the moment you hear a lick from Keith Richards' guitar, you know it's the Stones. Because Keith Richards sounds only like Keith Richards, just like The Edge sounds only like The Edge, and other Mark Knopfler sounds only like Mark Knopfler. Great guitarists, because they sound like nobody else. And you as a columnist should read like nobody else. And that takes a long time to do, but that's what you're trying to achieve. You're not just communicating a point of view or communicating information. You are exhibiting a style and a sensibility, and those have value in and of themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.